They say a wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of a woman's life. But at Thornfield Manor, the white roses weren't arranged for a celebration. By 8 a.m., they were already wilting in the shadow of a cold, calculated murder. Welcome back to Whisper Theory. Today, we unravel a crime where the champagne was left on ice and the tea was served with a side of cyanide. The morning of June 15th was destined to be a spectacle of high society. The sprawling Georgian estate of Thornfield Manor, tucked away in the rolling green hills of the Surrey countryside, had been polished to a mirror shine. It was the day Miss Evelyn Thornfield was set to marry Sir Geoffrey Markham. The ancient oak-paneled halls smelled of beeswax and anticipation. Staff moved with the silent, practiced rhythm of a household that knew its place and its purpose. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the iron-willed matriarch of the family, had orchestrated every detail. She was a woman who didn't just demand perfection. She purchased it. However, as the summer sun began to warm the manicured lawns, the atmosphere inside the manor shifted from festive anxiety to freezing horror. The preparations for the wedding breakfast abruptly ceased. The morning room, usually a sanctuary of light and correspondence, had become a tomb. At precisely 8 a.m., Pemberton, the manor's loyal butler of many decades, entered the room to deliver Lady Margaret's customary morning tea. What he found would haunt the estate forever. The elderly matriarch was not reviewing her guest list. She was slumped forward at her writing desk, her silver hair in disarray, her face mask-like and pale. Beside her, a teacup lay overturned on the desk, its dark contents seeping into the leather of her writing blotter. Scattered around her were papers, specifically, a will that appeared to be freshly amended, the ink barely dry. The family physician, Dr. Harrison, was summoned immediately, but there was no life left to save. The air in the room told the story before the doctor could even speak. It carried the faint, sickly sweet scent of bitter almonds, the undeniable signature of cyanide. Lady Margaret's lips were tinged with blue, a grim confirmation of the poison's efficiency. The local police were called, but Inspector Bradley, a man who understood the delicate nature of high society scandals, knew this was out of his depth. He placed a call to London, summoning the most renowned detective available. And so, the wedding guests found their celebration replaced by an investigation. It was into this atmosphere of suppressed panic and aristocratic silence that the investigation began. The detective noted immediately that the setting was too perfect. The ancient stones, the tended gardens, the facade of English propriety, it was all a mask. He remarked that a crime committed on the morning of a wedding wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of cold deliberation. To kill a grandmother on the day of her granddaughter's wedding required a mind that didn't just want to end a life. It wanted to destroy happiness itself. As the authorities secured the perimeter, the house seemed to hold its breath. A police constable stood guard at the grand entrance where joyous guests should have been arriving. Through the diamond-paned windows, figures moved with stiff, jerky motions, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a world that had just shattered. Pemberton, the butler, met the investigators at the door. He was a man composed of dignity and service, yet even he could not hide the slight tremor in his hands. The wedding was off. The mourning had begun, and somewhere within the walls of this elegant manor, a killer was washing their hands, waiting to play the part of the grieving relative. A single cup of tea. That was all it took to topple a dynasty. But as the investigation began, it wasn't just the poison that raised questions, it was the sugar. Why would a woman who hadn't eaten sugar in years suddenly sweeten her final drink? The detective and his companion were ushered into the grand hallway of Thornfield Manor. The transition from the sunny, optimistic countryside to the somber, heavy atmosphere of the house was jarring. Pemberton, despite his shock, maintained the professional veneer of a lifelong servant. He recounted the timeline with shaky precision. It was Lady Margaret's strict custom to take tea at 8 a.m. while she reviewed her letters. Pemberton had entered, found her dead, and touched nothing. He had acted with admirable presence of mind, locking the room and summoning the doctor. The morning room remained sealed, a capsule of the crime. Through the partially open door, the scene was visible. The body had been removed, but the chaotic desk remained. The overturned cup, the stained blotter, the scattered papers. It was a still life of violence. Inspector Bradley was already there, photographing the scene with a flash that seemed too bright for such a dark occasion. He confirmed the cause of death almost casually: cyanide. The only question that remained was how it was administered, and more importantly, by whom. The detective surveyed the room with eyes that missed nothing. He noted the intensity of the scene. He whispered to his companion that the answer wouldn't lie in what was visible, but in what was hidden. The invisible currents of family jealousy, greed, and loyalty. They moved to the drawing room to meet the mourners. It was a tableau of high tension. The wedding guests and family were clustered in hushed groups. Miss Evelyn Thornfield, the bride, rose to meet them. She was not the weeping, fragile creature one might expect. She possessed a quiet strength, her dark hair pulled back, her gray eyes intelligent and proud. Her wedding dress was notably absent, replaced by somber daywear, a sign she had already accepted that her life had changed course. She greeted the detective with old-fashioned formality, expressing gratitude for his arrival. Standing beside her was the groom, Sir Geoffrey Markham. He was handsome, athletic, and projected the image of a supportive partner. Yet there was something guarded in his handshake, a tightness in his jaw that suggested he was a man accustomed to keeping secrets. He spoke of the family's debt to the detective, but his eyes were wary. Then there was the rest of the family, arranged around the room like actors on a stage waiting for their cues. Lady Veronica Marsh, the victim's daughter, sat with rigid posture, her face a mask of austere grief. Every fold of her silk dress was perfect, but the whiteness around her lips betrayed her inner turmoil. Near the fireplace stood Clara Marsh, Lady Veronica's daughter. She was striking, with auburn hair and a cigarette held in a hand that trembled ever so slightly. She projected an air of insolent curiosity, almost bored by the tragedy, a defense mechanism that the detective noted immediately. Finally, by the window, stood Henry Thornfield, Lady Margaret's son. He looked like a man who had once been handsome but had let life defeat him. His face bore the marks of dissipation and disappointment. He broke the silence with bitter sarcasm, suggesting that since they were family, they were naturally all suspects now. It was a cynical remark, but it cut close to the truth. The detective watched them all. He realized quickly that the ink on the amended will found on the desk was indeed damp. Lady Margaret had changed her legacy moments before she died. This sent a ripple of tension through the room. Sir Geoffrey gripped the mantelpiece. Clara's cigarette shook. Lady Veronica closed her eyes for a split second. The motive was hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a financial standoff. The detective realized that the inheritance was hanging in the balance, and everyone in that room knew it. The circle of suspects was complete, and the game had officially begun. Money, power, and control. Lady Margaret Thornfield used them like weapons against her own children. As the interviews began, the detective discovered that everyone had a reason to want the matriarch dead, but who had the nerve to actually do it? The library of Thornfield Manor was chosen for the interrogations. It was a room lined with mahogany and leather-bound books, a place that seemed designed to absorb secrets. The detective settled into a wing-backed chair, preparing to peel back the layers of this respectable family. He knew that under the pressure of a murder investigation, the polite facade of the aristocracy would crumble, revealing the ugly truths beneath. Evelyn, the bride, was the first to face the questions. She maintained her composure, though her voice carried the weight of the morning's horror. She explained that she had last seen her grandmother the previous evening at dinner. Lady Margaret had been excited, almost triumphant, speaking of making provisions to ensure the family's future happiness. Evelyn revealed that her grandmother had summoned her late the previous night to discuss changes to the will, adjustments meant to reward worthy behavior and prevent the Thornfield fortune from being wasted on unsuitable alliances. This was a crucial piece of information. Lady Margaret was using her money to control the personal lives of her descendants. Evelyn also dropped a bombshell. She had heard a heated argument in the library just before 10 p.m. She heard her grandmother's cold voice saying, "Then we understand one another perfectly. You shall have nothing, absolutely nothing." A man had answered, but Evelyn couldn't identify the voice. She suspected her father, Henry, but admitted that her fiancé, Sir Geoffrey, had also been in to see Lady Margaret earlier. When Sir Geoffrey took the chair, the strain on his handsome features was evident. He admitted that Lady Margaret had been thorough, too thorough, in her inquiries about his finances. She had insisted on specific prenuptial arrangements. He tried to play it off as standard procedure, but his body language screamed discomfort. He admitted he had been in the library, but claimed it was only to review final wedding details. However, the detective sensed a man walking a tightrope. Then came Henry Thornfield, the prodigal son. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He threw himself into the chair and let his resentment flow freely. He described his mother as a financial tyrant who used her wealth as a weapon. She had cut off his allowance 6 months prior, telling a 43-year-old man he needed to learn responsibility. He was bitter, broke, and angry. He openly admitted that they all danced to her tune because they had no choice. Clara Marsh, the rebellious granddaughter, was next. She smoked throughout the interview, a deliberate act of defiance. She painted a picture of a grandmother who disapproved of everything about her. Her independence, her refusal to marry a boring squire, and her scandalous writing career. Lady Margaret had threatened to cut her off entirely after Evelyn's wedding. Clara seemed to wear her motive like a badge of honor, daring the detective to accuse her. Finally, Lady Veronica, the victim's daughter, sat down. She was the most composed of them all, a woman of steel wrapped in silk. She spoke carefully, describing her mother as a woman of strong opinions who believed in maintaining standards. She admitted that, while her late husband had left her comfortable, Lady Margaret controlled the bulk of the family fortune. She used that control to ensure her children remained attentive. As the interviews concluded, the detective had a clear picture of the household dynamics. It was a dictatorship. Lady Margaret ruled through financial terror. Her death would liberate every single person in that house. They all had a motive. Financial desperation, thwarted independence, the threat of disinheritance. It was a perfect collection of reasons to kill. But motive is not enough. The detective needed to find the person who had the means and the cold-blooded opportunity to turn that resentment into a lethal dose of cyanide. The police thought they had it all figured out. A perfect timeline, a clear cause of death. But the detective noticed something the police missed, a teacup that didn't belong. Why would a creature of habit change her routine on the day she died? By mid-afternoon, Inspector Bradley was beaming with confidence. He believed he had the case wrapped up. He gathered the detective and his companion in the library to present his timeline. He had traced the movement of the fatal cup of tea from the kitchen to the morning room with the efficiency of a bloodhound. According to Bradley, the housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, prepared the tea at 7:45 a.m. Pemberton collected it at 8 a.m. and placed it on the desk. The room was empty. The tea was poisoned. It seemed simple. Bradley confirmed the preparation. 1 cup, 1 sugar lump, Lady Margaret's exact preference for decades. But the detective was not so easily satisfied. He had observed irregularities that the police, in their rush for a solution, had overlooked. He pointed out the teacup itself. Mrs. Hartwell had confirmed that Lady Margaret always used the blue spode china for her morning tea. It was a ritual. Yet, the shards of the cup on the desk were from the Crown Derby set, a much finer, more ornate china reserved for special occasions. Why the switch? Even more intriguing was the sugar. Dr. Harrison had confirmed that Lady Margaret had been managing diabetes for years. She avoided sugar religiously. Yet the residue in the cup showed clear signs of sugar crystals. Someone had sweetened her final cup. This presented a paradox. Either the victim abandoned a lifelong medical necessity in her final moments, or the person who made the tea didn't know about her diabetes. They knew she liked tea, they knew the general routine, but they didn't know the intimate, private details of her health. The kitchen staff provided more puzzle pieces. Mrs. Hartwell, a paragon of domestic order, was indignant. She reported that someone had been in her kitchen during the night. The sugar bowl had been moved slightly, and the Crown Derby cup was missing from its display shelf, only to appear on the victim's tray the next morning. The detective realized they were dealing with a contradiction. The murder was planned with the cold calculation of cyanide, implying a premeditated act. Yet the execution was sloppy in the details: the wrong cup, the unwanted sugar. It suggested a killer who was observing the household from a distance, or perhaps someone who focused on the grand scheme, but missed the small, domestic realities of Lady Margaret's life. Inspector Bradley was less interested in china patterns and more interested in physical evidence. He announced a breakthrough. He had found a silver snuff box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Henry Thornfield's study. Inside was a small vial containing traces of potassium cyanide. It was a perfect match for the poison used. The evidence against Henry was damning. He was broke. He was angry. He had been heard arguing with his mother, and now the murder weapon was found in his room. Pemberton even admitted to seeing Henry enter the morning room very early, before the rest of the house was awake. To the police, the case was closed. They had their man. But the detective looked at the snuff box with skepticism. It was too perfect. It fit too well. Why would a man who had lived 43 years without violence suddenly turn to matricide? And if he did, why would he hide the poison in such an obvious place, to be found within hours? The detective sensed a setup. The clues were screaming, "Henry did it," which to a mind like his suggested that someone else was screaming it even louder. They found the poison in his room. They had the motive. They had the opportunity. Henry Thornfield looked like the perfect killer. But the detective knew that in the world of murder, when something looks too good to be true, it's usually a lie. The discovery of the snuff box in Henry's room sent a shockwave through the investigation. Inspector Bradley was ready to make an arrest. Henry, naturally, denied everything. He claimed he had never seen the box before, insisted it was planted, and shouted that he was being framed. But desperate men say desperate things, and to the police, his protests were just the noise of a guilty man caught in a trap. The detective, however, held the ornate snuff box in his gloved hands and turned it over thoughtfully. He began to profile the psychology of the situation. They were looking at a man desperate for money, yes, but Henry was also a man of inertia, a man who had let life happen to him. Does such a person suddenly develop the icy nerve required to poison his own mother? And more importantly, does he then leave the evidence under a loose floorboard that might as well have had a neon sign pointing to it? Desperate men make foolish mistakes, Bradley argued, but the detective countered. A rational man, even a desperate one, does not commit murder on the morning of his niece's wedding when the house is full of witnesses. It was theatrical. It was staged. The detective's little gray cells whispered of a more subtle game. Someone had taken great pains to ensure Henry appeared guilty. This realization shifted the entire focus of the inquiry. If Henry was being framed, then the real killer was someone who knew Henry's vulnerabilities. They knew he was in debt. They knew he was fighting with his mother. They used him as a convenient scapegoat. This meant the murderer was calculating, cruel, and very much still in the room. The detective gathered the group again, watching their reactions to the news of the evidence against Henry. He saw relief on some faces, anxiety on others. He realized he had solved one mystery, who the police thought did it, only to be deeper in the actual mystery. The question now wasn't just who killed Lady Margaret. It was, who hates Henry enough or needs a scapegoat badly enough to send an innocent man to the gallows? He decided to deploy psychological warfare. He needed to shake the real killer's confidence. He spent the afternoon conducting experiments in conversation. He approached Sir Geoffrey in the library. He brought up the marriage settlement papers again. Geoffrey's hand tightened on the documents. The detective pressed him, suggesting that Lady Margaret had made requirements that Geoffrey found impossible. The handsome groom finally cracked. He admitted that his estate was heavily mortgaged. He was broke. Lady Margaret had found out. She threatened to expose his financial ruin to Evelyn unless he signed a humiliating prenuptial agreement that cut him off from the Thornfield fortune entirely. She also implied she knew about shady business dealings in his past. Geoffrey had a motive that went beyond money. It was about social survival. If the wedding didn't happen, or if it happened under her terms, he was finished. Then the detective moved to Clara. He probed her regarding her writing. Clara, defiant as ever, admitted she wrote crime fiction under a pseudonym. She knew about poisons. She knew about cyanide. She even bragged that any competent mystery writer knows how to mask the taste of bitter almonds with sugar. It was a slip, or a boast. She had just described the exact method used to kill her grandmother. Was it a confession, or the arrogance of an innocent woman who thought she was smarter than the police? She wrote murder mysteries for a living. She knew how to hide evidence, how to mask poison, and how to fool the police. Clara Marsh seemed like the perfect suspect, but was she writing her own crime, or was someone else using her plot? Clara Marsh became a fascinating focal point for the detective. Here was a woman who made her living constructing theoretical murders. During her interview, she revealed that her grandmother had discovered her secret identity as a crime writer and was furious. Lady Margaret considered it a stain on the family name and threatened to expose Clara's pseudonym, which would have ruined her literary career and cut off her allowance. But the most chilling detail was Clara's admission about the mechanics of death. She spoke casually of how cyanide could be concealed in sweet substances. She treated the murder investigation like a masterclass she was critiquing. This arrogance was dangerous. The detective wondered, did Clara kill her grandmother to silence her, using a plot from one of her own books? Or was someone else in the family watching Clara, learning from her, and stealing her ideas to frame her if the Henry frame-up failed? As the day wore on, the detective moved through the manor like a ghost, observing the subtle interactions. He saw Geoffrey glancing anxiously at Lady Veronica. He saw Clara whispering conspiratorially with Henry. The alliances in the house were shifting. During tea time, a grim affair given the circumstances, the detective dropped a stone into the pond to see the ripples. He announced to the room at large that the most dangerous lies are those closest to the truth. He watched them. Lady Veronica's teacup rattled, Clara smirked, Geoffrey frowned. They were all on edge. They knew he was hunting them. The detective noted that the killer was likely an amateur. The crime was high concept but low execution. The use of cyanide was dramatic, the kind of thing one reads about in novels. But the mistake with the sugar and the china pattern showed a lack of attention to detail. A professional criminal would have known the victim's habits better. This was a crime of theory, not practice. As evening approached, the tension in the house was palpable. The dinner proceeded with mechanical precision. The detective decided to break the silence. He spoke about the sugar. He mentioned how strange it was that Lady Margaret would break decades of habit. He watched their hands. Lady Veronica's fork trembled. She was the daughter. She should have known her mother's habits best. Why was she so nervous about a discussion regarding sugar? The detective realized that the killer was someone who knew the house, knew the schedule, but didn't know the victim intimately. Or perhaps they had been estranged emotionally for so long that they had forgotten the small details of her life. He invited everyone to the drawing room. The psychological game was escalating. He told them that murder requires a specific state of mind, a willingness to cross a line most people find impassable. He began to probe their moral compasses. He asked Geoffrey about desperation. He asked Clara about the line between fiction and reality. He asked Henry about the feeling of being cheated. He was pushing them, waiting for someone to snap. He was looking for the weak link. And just as he felt he was getting close, the silence of the manor was shattered by a scream. It came from the servants' quarters. The game had just turned deadly serious. The killer was panicking. The first murder was calculated, elegant, cold. But now a scream from the pantry revealed a messy, desperate attempt to cover tracks. The butler had seen something he wasn't supposed to, and now he was paying the price. The scream belonged to Mrs. Hartwell. The detective and the family rushed to the butler's pantry to find a chaotic scene. Pemberton, the steady, reliable soul of the house, was collapsed on the floor. His face was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. Beside him lay an overturned cup of cocoa. Dr. Harrison was there in seconds. "Cyanide again," he announced grimly. But this time the dose was smaller, or perhaps Pemberton hadn't finished the drink. He was unconscious, barely clinging to life, but he was alive. The implications were terrifying. The killer was still active. The first murder had been about inheritance or control. This second attack was about survival. It was an attempt to silence a witness. The detective immediately took charge, shedding his observer persona. He ordered Inspector Bradley to seal the house completely. No one in, no one out. He ordered the doctor to stay by Pemberton's side constantly. The butler's survival was now the key to the entire case. They searched Pemberton's small room and found the reason for the attack. Tucked beneath his mattress was a small leather journal. It turned out the butler was a chronicler of the household. He wrote down everything. The detective opened the book and found the entries for the last 24 hours. The journal was a bombshell. Pemberton had recorded seeing someone in the morning room at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the body was supposedly found. He also noted observing unusual activity late the previous night. He had written, June 14th, 11:30 p.m. Observed someone preparing tomorrow's tea service. Replaced customary blue spode with crown derby. Most irregular. Must inquire in the morning. Pemberton had witnessed the preparation of the murder weapon. He had seen the killer setting the trap. The killer must have realized that Pemberton knew, or perhaps Pemberton had tried to blackmail them, or simply asked an innocent question that terrified them. The detective addressed the family again. "The butler saw everything," he told them, "and someone tried to kill him to keep this journal a secret." He pointed out the difference between the two crimes. Lady Margaret's murder was planned. The china, the poison, the timing, it was all thought out, even if flawed. But the attack on Pemberton was sloppy. It was hasty. It was the act of a terrified amateur. The killer was unraveling. The cool facade was gone, replaced by frantic desperation. This changed the profile. They weren't looking for a mastermind anymore. They were looking for someone who was scared, someone who was improvising. The detective looked at the faces in the room. Who looked the most terrified? Who looked like they were barely holding it together? The answer lay in the journal. Pemberton had noted seeing someone, but the entry stopped short of naming them in the summary the detective read aloud. He kept that final piece of information to himself, using it as bait. He let the family believe that he knew the name, forcing the killer to sweat, to wonder if the game was truly up. The butler's journal was the smoking gun. It proved the murder wasn't a morning impulse. It was a midnight plot. But as the detective analyzed the handwriting and the timing, he realized the killer had made a fundamental error. They forgot that in a house like Thornfield, the servants see everything. The atmosphere in Thornfield Manor had shifted from mourning to claustrophobia. The guests were trapped in a house with a double poisoner. The detective spent the morning analyzing the new timeline established by Pemberton's journal. The journal revealed that the tea service wasn't prepared in the morning by Mrs. Hartwell as everyone assumed. It was set up the night before. This explained the cold tea, perhaps, or at least the premeditation. The killer had sneaked into the kitchen, stolen the fancy cup, put the cyanide and sugar in it, and placed it on the desk late at night, knowing Lady Margaret would drink it blindly in the morning. This confirmed the outsider theory. A member of the staff would never have used the wrong cup. Only a family member, someone who didn't deal with the domestic chores, would make that mistake. They chose the Crown Derby because it looked expensive and worthy of the lady, not knowing she hated using it for daily tea. The detective then revealed another crucial piece of information he had held back. He had been studying Lady Margaret's will again. The amended version, the one found on the desk, contained a provision that the killer clearly didn't know about. Lady Margaret had actually had a change of heart. In the new will, she removed the conditions on Evelyn's inheritance. She wrote that true happiness cannot be legislated. She was going to let Evelyn marry Geoffrey without the financial strings. She was effectively softening her grip. This was tragic irony. The killer had murdered her to stop her from cutting them off or controlling them, not realizing that she was about to give them exactly what they wanted. The murder was unnecessary. It was a waste. The detective gathered the suspects for what he called the final movement of his symphony. He explained this irony to them. He watched Evelyn gasp. He watched Geoffrey close his eyes in pain. If they had just waited one more day, everything would have been fine. The killer had acted out of fear of a threat that no longer existed. The pressure in the room was unbearable. The detective announced that he knew who the killer was. He stated that the killer was someone who knew the household routines but misunderstood the details. Someone who knew about the will changes but not the specific content. someone who had theoretical knowledge of crime but no practice. He told them to return to the library that evening for the final revelation. He was giving the killer a few hours to stew in their own panic. He knew that under this pressure, the guilty party might try to run or confess or make another mistake. He positioned Inspector Bradley at the doors. The trap was set. The mouse was already inside. It just didn't know the door had snapped shut. It all came down to a teacup. The Crown Derby versus the Blue Spode. It seemed like a trivial detail, but to the detective, it was the fingerprint of the killer. It proved that the murderer was someone who tried too hard to make the scene look perfect, and in doing so, proved they didn't belong. The finale began in the library. The setting was theatrical, shadows and lamplight, a circle of chairs facing the detective. He stood by the desk, the fragments of the broken teacup arranged like jewels before him. "We are looking for a psychological profile," the detective began, his voice calm and commanding. "We need someone who is proud, desperate, and fundamentally disconnected from the reality of this home." He started eliminating suspects. He turned to Sir Geoffrey. "You, sir, were desperate, but your grief feels real. You are a man of pride. You would not celebrate your freedom with such genuine sorrow. And more importantly, you stood to gain from the new will had you known about it. You are not the killer." He turned to Evelyn. "You are the bride. You loved your grandmother despite her tyranny. You had the most to lose by a scandal on your wedding day." He turned to Henry. "You, sir, were the perfect scapegoat. The snuff box in your room was too obvious. It was a plant. You are a victim of a frame-up, not a murderer." He turned to Clara. "And you, the crime writer, you provided the blueprint. You talked about cyanide and sugar. You are the library from which the killer borrowed their ideas. But you are a professional of theory. You would never have made the mistake with the china. You know that details matter. You would have checked which cup she used. The error was too amateur for you." The room fell silent. Only one person remained. The detective's eyes locked onto Lady Veronica Marsh. The daughter, the administrator, the woman of steel. "Lady Veronica," the detective said softly, "you killed your mother." He laid out the logic. Lady Veronica had been managing the estate's accounts for years. She was the one who kept the books. Lady Margaret had announced a full review of the finances along with the will change. That was the threat. It wasn't about the will disinheriting her. It was about the audit exposing her. "You have been embezzling from this estate for 15 years, the detective declared. "Small amounts over time, but a comprehensive review would have revealed everything. Prison, disgrace, ruin." Lady Veronica sat motionless. The detective continued. "You knew she took tea. You wanted to make it a special final cup, so you used the expensive Crown Derby, not realizing she never used it. You added sugar to hide the cyanide because you heard Clara say that's how it's done in books, but you forgot, or didn't care, that your mother was diabetic. You were so focused on the money, you forgot the mother." He revealed that Pemberton's journal entry mentioned seeing a woman in a silk dress entering the morning room late at night. Lady Veronica. She had tried to kill the butler because he had seen her setting the stage. For 15 years, she had stolen from her own family. For one morning, she became a murderer. Lady Veronica Marsh thought she could bury her secrets with her mother. She was wrong. The game is over and justice, cold and final, has arrived. The accusation hung in the air. Lady Veronica Marsh, the picture of aristocratic dignity, sat frozen. Then slowly the mask cracked. Her shoulders slumped. The tension that had held her upright for days, perhaps for years, evaporated. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice stripped of its haughty tone. It was a voice of defeat. "Since I realized the killer was an amateur trying to be a professional," the detective replied. Lady Veronica nodded. She didn't scream or deny it. She confessed with a chilling calmness. "I stole from her," she admitted. "For years. I felt I was owed it. She controlled every breath we took. I thought I was taking my fair share." She explained that when Lady Margaret announced the audit, she knew her life was over. She panicked. She remembered Clara's stories about cyanide. It seemed poetic. The woman who poisoned their lives would die by poison. She planted the snuff box on Henry because he was the easy target, the failure of the family. She tried to kill Pemberton because he looked at her the wrong way the next morning, and she knew he knew. "I tried to save my reputation," she said bitterly, "and in doing so I lost everything." Inspector Bradley stepped forward with the handcuffs. The click of the metal was the only sound in the room. As Lady Veronica was led away, she held her head high, clinging to the last shreds of her dignity, a murderer in silk. The detective watched her go. He turned to the remaining family members, Geoffrey, Evelyn, Henry, Clara. They were shell-shocked. The wedding was ruined, the grandmother was dead, the aunt was going to prison. But the truth was out. The financial stranglehold was broken. "The game is ended," the detective murmured to his companion. "Justice has been served, even if it arrived with a heavy price." As they left Thornfield Manor, the sun was setting over the Surrey hills. The house, once a symbol of perfection, now stood as a monument to the rot that can grow beneath the surface of respectability. The case of the wedding day murder was closed. This has been whisper theory. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're sitting at the head of the table, sipping tea. If you enjoyed this mystery, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories from the shadows. Until next time, stay quiet and stay curious.